Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Asia Society Policy Institute's post-election wrap-up of policy issues related to the U.S. and Asia. I'm Rorry Daniels. I'm the Managing Director of the Policy Institute, and I'm delighted to be here today to guide this discussion at a really interesting moment in U.S. policy trajectory and prioritization. The United States has just gone to the polls and elected Donald Trump for the second time to a new administration. He will come into office in January. Many of his key appointees have been nominated, and we're starting to see the shape of what a second-term Trump policy agenda might look like. To unpack some of these issues today, we have a really wonderful panel of distinguished guests, including the President and CEO of Asia Society, Dr. Kyung-wha, and two of our ASPE non-resident distinguished fellows, Raja Mohan joining us from Delhi and Sir Robin Niblett joining us today from the UK. So without further ado, I want to just launch in and get policy perspectives and insights from this great group of guests. I'm going to turn first to Dr. Kang. Dr. Kang is now President and CEO of the Asia Society. She also has had a distinguished career in government, including serving as Foreign Minister of the Republic of Korea and at various high-level roles at the United Nations. So, Kyung-wha, if I may, I think one huge difference that we are seeing between the Biden-Harris administration and a second Trump administration is their approach to U.S. allies and partners. The Biden administration really centered alliances as critical to advancing United States national interests and to upholding a free, fair, and open international rules-based order. We know from President Trump's first term that he has a very different and quite transactional approach to U.S. alliances. He's referred to U.S. defense commitments as a type of insurance that should be valued much more highly. And he's called on allies, including in his first term, the Republic of Korea, to contribute more to their own defense. You were in office in Korea during Trump's first term. You worked with the U.S., but also spent a lot of time engaging with other U.S. allies and partners. I'd love to ask you, what do you think U.S. allies are preparing for over the next 4 to 5 years? Is this an opportunity for allies to come together and work more closely, or do you think this greater attention to bilateral negotiation with the U.S. could create distance among this allied network in Asia? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rorry, and really happy to be on the same panel with Raja and Robin. Wonderful to see you on the screen. And Rorry, it's a great panel that you've organized, and I think, getting straight to the question that you asked, not to underestimate the efforts of the Biden administration to rally allies together at the end to contain China. And I think we've seen a great deal of effort in this direction over the past 4 years, but the togetherness within that rallying, I think, has been quite different depending upon the allies. So it has always been a hubs and spokes model, and regardless of the efforts of the U.S. to bring greater solidarity within that structure, it still remains a hubs and spokes model. And so if you remove the U.S. push to bring this more together, you still have the same structure, and you still have the same bilateral allies who prize that bilateral alliance with the United States, but have also been working closely together prior to the Biden administration push toward a more aligned regional security order. For example, South Korea always worked very closely with Australia. Work very closely with the ASEAN countries, especially during our government's term. Japan is a little bit different for various difficult historical reasons, but the new trilateral cooperation between the United States, Korea, and Japan, the famous Washington Consensus, was possible not because the push from Washington, but because the Korea and Japan had decided at the very beginning of the current Yoon government to leave aside the past and just let's move on. And without that, the two sides coming, this trilateral collaboration, closer trilateral collaboration would have been very difficult to put together. So the question is, will that bilateral closeness stay with the United States no longer pushing for that? So I don't think it's the absence or the continuation of that U.S. bringing the two sides together, but what the two sides are going to do together to manage this relationship that has become quite close because of the decision of the current government. And is that sustainable? When at the end, the issue of the past all the issues of the past have not been fully resolved. So I would say the push for the regional solidarity among the allies, yes, but because it's that effort on the part of the Biden administration is no longer there, is this going to fall apart? I don't think so. I mean, the bilateral alliances are important to these individual countries in itself, and these are also being like-minded countries. I think the collaboration bilaterally between Korea, Australia, between the many countries of ASEAN and the Korea-India relations will also continue to be deepened. I think the importance is seen on both sides in any of these bilateral ties.
Thanks. I think that points to a lot of areas of continuity that should be reassuring, right? So you've talked a little bit about Biden's goals of pulling the allies together to confront or contain China. It's certainly something we're going to see again in a Trump second term, the hub and smoke model not changing, but then the key determinant being the political will in these allied countries to see a value in those relationships with each other beyond just the appeasement or attention to U.S. interests in pulling the. No.
I think if I could just add, at the bilateral level, it will be tough going with the Trump administration because of the transactional nature with which the Trump administration has seen these. And we were at the receiving end of that during the first administration, and having to negotiate the cost sharing for the troop station in Korea was, at the end, we couldn't come to an agreement despite all the concessions and really making a push to expand that share. At the end, we couldn't come to an agreement with the first Trump administration. The current administration has reached a new agreement for greater cost to be shared, but to be shouldered by the South Korean government. And I wouldn't be surprised if the new administration comes in and just puts that on the shelves and says, let's negotiate fresh.
Yeah, certainly a really challenging time for U.S. allies to be anticipating those types of negotiations. I want to turn, if we can, to the connection between what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Asia, especially when it comes to how the Trump administration might prioritize and sequence their policy decisions early in his term. So I'd love to ask Robin, who is, in addition to being a proud non-resident distinguished fellow of the Asia Society Policy Institute, also former director of Chatham House UK. I think President-elect Trump has emphasized finding an early end to the conflict in Ukraine. And certainly there are expectations that Trump's kind of pre-existing much closer relationship with Vladimir Putin and his opposition to NATO expansion would create some political will, perhaps in Moscow, but also in Kiev, to find a solution to draw this conflict to a freeze, if not a full close. Some variables, like how, if the war ends and on what terms, are still to be determined, and I think difficult to predict. But these larger trends, like Russia's solidarity with China and U.S. ambivalence toward providing and defending global public goods, particularly in defense, they may have long-term implications. Can you talk us through a little bit how Europe sees its interests evolving in a second Trump term, and particularly, if you can, how those interests might be linked to Europe's attitudes and views towards policy with Asia?
Well, thank you, Rory, and thanks very much for the opportunity. Wonderful to be on this call and at such a pivotal moment. And again, fantastic to be with two great colleagues, including the president of the institute, so fantastic, and of the society itself. And to be able to bring this kind of global set of different perspectives, zero, because I suppose we're all looking at this from all sorts of angles. I have to say, in Europe, I think there's deep anxiety, not least because European governments themselves are at the moment in a very weak, fractious state, of the leading powers, France and Germany, face and to their economic situation. The UK outside the EU, therefore not able to be a balancing and constructive player as much as it would like to be if it was inside the EU, and therefore difficulties in coordinating the position and a risk of fragmentation. When it comes to Ukraine, the big danger, I think, here for European governments is the fear of a deal that leaves them alone dealing with a still very unhappy Russia. Because it's very, very hard from a European perspective to see through to a true peace agreement. A ceasefire, maybe, though even that could prove challenging. But a peace agreement would require not just an acceptance by the Ukrainian government of a loss of territory, which is going to be very difficult, but would require the Russian government to agree to make huge reparation costs to Ukraine. The Europeans are not going to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine that's been destroyed in a legal war of aggression. The idea that we would give the 300 billion rough dollars that are frozen principally in the Belgian sort of controlled SWIFT system, so that all those very large component of Russia's central bank reserves that were frozen right at the beginning of the conflict, those would probably end up being seized at some point, because I don't see the Russians signing off. We will have war crimes tribunals of some sort over the human rights abuses and the war crimes that were undertaken, especially in the early phase of the conflict. So you're going to end up with a situation where it's going to be very, very difficult for European governments and the Russian government, never mind where the Ukrainian government stands, to come to a clear long-term peace agreement. And the reason I mention this is not just because, you can see a President Trump saying, look, I'm going to tell my friend Vladimir he's got to stop invading, and I'm going to tell my maybe good friend Volodymyr he needs to stop fighting back as well. And then, we can all get on very well with each other. And I'm done. I'm now moving to some other part of my agenda. That kind of very cavalier approach to diplomacy, as I said, would leave Europe with the responsibility for Ukraine's future, but at the same time not being able to repair its relationship with Russia. And the reason this matters, amongst other things, is that if we cannot repair the relationship with Russia, then the European relationship with China keeps getting worse. And this has been obviously, I think, one of the most interesting dynamics of the last year and a half has been this sense that, in a way, Europeans have become harsher and harsher in their interpretation and their position and their attitude towards China, not just because of the economic risks that are being imposed to the German car industry, for example, or over-dependence on China for green energy capabilities, but because we now see China backing Russia in this war of aggression, with certainly dual-use components being provided to Russian forces, such that European governments and the EU has now sanctioned Chinese companies, not just Russian companies. But at the same time, certain reports that maybe the Chinese have been providing some intelligence to help Russians do targeting, and some more explicit forms of military equipment, drone, engines, etc. So if you talk to European diplomats today, the attitude to China has got a double negative. It's the negative that we're facing an unfair competitor at a moment when Europe is weak, and we're facing an unfair China that is backing the country that has brought war and destruction back to the European continent at a time we thought this is gone forever, you know. And I was in Beijing at a conference back in early July, and on the record panel of European ambassadors was by far the harshest in its criticism of China, harsher than the Americans who were on some of the other panels. So I think the worry here, if I can, I'll close on this because there's so much more one could say about Ukraine, but to really tie it to what we're talking about here, Europe could end up having to manage a low-grade semi-hot, cold, frozen conflict, with us responsible for keeping Ukraine afloat and America pulling back from it, at the same time as China remains connected, therefore, to supporting Russia in its position. And Europe is left with an ambivalent, not particularly helpful America, and a China that we can't repair our relationship with. That is a really nasty mix to find yourself in. So why don't I stop there, and hopefully I can say something more optimistic later on in the call.
Okay, thank you so much for walking us through that. I think some of the dynamics that you've surfaced, including kind of European pragmatism itself, are things that are going to be really volatile, dynamic over the next 4 years for all of the reasons that you laid out. I mean, what we're seeing broadly, I think, and this is really where I want to turn to Raja, is the rise of a more multipolar world where countries are expected to kind of take on more and more of their own burdens, but also we're seeing partnerships develop in new and interesting ways. So let me turn to Professor Raja Mohan, who, in addition to being a distinguished non-resident fellow at ASPE, is a prolific global commentator and a really close follower of India's foreign relations and Indian policy, as well as the whole South Asian region and how it links to the broader Asia. So Raja, the rise of a more multipolar world, which I think is a trend that the Trump team acknowledges, even if they want to really preserve U.S. dominance of the global order, a lot of their criticism of policy as usual is that it has given rise to a more multipolar world. And therefore that America is in relative decline. This trend really does cast India as a key U.S. partner in the Indo-Pacific and in the world. And I think that Washington sees India as a critical balancing force against China's growing power, but also perhaps a secondary bridge to the developing world. India participates in many of the multilateral institutions, including BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others, of which the U.S. is not a member or not a driver of the agenda. India, of course, has been famously non-aligned and is now even pursuing détente with China on border issues, even as Delhi deepens its ties with Washington and, maintains friendly contact with Moscow. So what can India teach us about how to navigate multipolarity? And do you feel like it's positioned well to manage the volatility in the international system through the next Trump term?
Thanks, Rorry. It's wonderful to be on this panel. I don't know if India can teach the rest of the world, but let me say something about how at least one perspective from Delhi. I think the reference to multipolar world, I think, does not fully capture one important paradox, the paradox of American power. While a number of other actors have risen in the international system, most of them in Asia and in the non-Western world, it's interesting to see that the American power continues to grow. It's actually Europe that has been on decline, relatively speaking. Eurozone size vis-a-vis the US is coming down. China has slowed down. So I think all the talk about American decline, elegant or otherwise, is actually not true on the ground. American power is continuing to grow in relation to its peers and its competitors. But the fact is there are a number of other actors. The problem with the American power is not its decline, but the enormous variability, the volatility in the way Americans think it should be exercised. Given the deep divisions within the United States, how the US uses its power. So that's what constantly the rest of us in the world have to deal with it, because the US has the power to disrupt the international system or redirect it, misdirect it, whatever you want to call it. So you can't just simply ignore American power. And what you don't fully understand is how will it actually play out in terms of given the domestic politics of the US has become a major variable in how the US deals with the world. So I think that's why most of us have to pay so much attention to American domestic politics, the internal debates, to get a better grasp of what it does with the rest of the world. That doesn't mean there are no continuities. I mean, there are, for example, Trump first term was the one which framed the Indo-Pacific. It really revived the Quad. It's really laid down the basis for balancing China. In a way, Biden administration has actually built on it. But at the same time, the kind of mixed signals that come from the US always keeps everybody on tenterhooks in terms of what it actually will do. Second, I think the China question, if American power is a paradox, the Chinese centrality makes it very, very hard for all of us. We can't ignore China. China is right in the middle of us, India. And all of us, even though we have problems with the Chinese unilateral assertion of Chinese power, we still have to live with China, which is next door. Uncle Sam is far away, but China is next door. So I think for us, even when we have very, very big differences, India has had the biggest differences with China, for example, on border issue, on a range of other issues. Yet we've had to maintain a sustained military dialogue to resolve those issues. Because you can't simply say, look, Americans want to balance China, therefore let's simply go with the Americans, because Americans will change their mind. So therefore, Chinese power is a reality. So I think how we deal with China, it has to be tough policy, it has to be measured policy, but I think we got to live with China, and I think that is the real challenge the Asian countries will face as the new administration comes in. And third, I would say on the Russian question, India got a lot of flack for not taking the position our European friends have taken on Russian invasion. But now, 3 years into the war, it is a Republican Party which is questioning the Ukraine policy. A large part of the Republican Party, including some of the nominees for high security posts, are saying, look, it's a waste of time. Let's focus on Asia. Let's cut a deal with Putin and move on. So I think there again, US can change its mind because it's far away from Eurasia. Therefore, how it thinks about the problems can change. But those of us who live in this continent will have to find our own solutions while dealing with American power. And I think that's where I'll go with what Minister Kang said, that look, we have to keep finding ways of expanding inter-regional cooperation within Asia. To some extent, the Biden administration has promoted that, and between Europe and Asia. There again, the so-called Asia-Pacific Forum in NATO, I think that's a good step. But I think Europe and Asia have not really worked together on Eurasian security, and I think that's a direction we need to do more with each other. And that's the only way you can keep the Americans in. All of us have a stake in keeping the Americans in. The only way of doing it is better forms of burden sharing and better regional cooperation so that the US does not feel everyone is a free rider on the base of American taxpayer.
Thank you, Raja, for taking us through some complex thinking on this, and pointing out that, it's not so much the decline of American power in the world, but it's really how the power is exercised that is changing and evolving, and sometimes rapidly pendulum swinging between two administrations, which makes it very difficult for the rest of the countries of the world to predict how to satisfy American interests and therefore how to shape their own interest around it in cooperative ways. I want to turn a little bit to some kind of specific issues that are likely to come up in the next couple of years. So going back to Kyung-wha, I think we're all wondering how the priorities of Trump's first term are going to carry over into a second term. Some things have been very clearly stated in terms of, what the plans are for trade relations with China, or again, for Ukraine, perhaps even for the Middle East. But the first Trump administration also pursued some bold diplomatic initiatives, including an attempt to negotiate with North Korea on denuclearization. Obviously, a lot has changed over the last 6 years since the Hanoi summit and the subsequent meeting at Panmunjom between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, a process which ended without a deal. Do you think circumstances today support another attempt at U.S.-North Korea diplomacy? Kind of walk us through your thinking and your expectations on this topic.
Okay. Well, before I do that, I'd just like to echo what Raja has said about the importance of Europe, Asia greater collaboration between the countries of the two regions. I was recently in Europe, and as Europe declines, the mentality is still very transatlantic, and it's although it's clear intellectually the self-interest lies in doing more in the Southern Asian direction. It was very difficult to get the discussions going about Asia and Europe, and not Europe's decline vis-a-vis. Even the decline was measured against the United States and not the rest of the world. So I think, the thought leaders and policymakers have a lot to do to push the thinking in that direction. But on the first Trump initiative to engage with North Korea, I think that given the circumstances at that time, it was the right thing to do. North Korea's young leader was desperate to get out of the sanctions and bring economic better times to the people. South Korea was wanting to establish peaceful coexistence with North Korea. Russia also was on board in working with the United States to get North Korea to the table to discuss denuclearization. The style was a little bit unorthodox from the US side, coming at the top level with very little prep done at the working levels. And at the end, that was one of the big reasons why it didn't work. But at that time, you had the four surrounding powers, South Korea, Japan, all working together to get North Korea to engage in denuclearization talks. Too bad it didn't lead to any concrete consequences or results. And I think that has then rippled through the current security situation in Northeast Asia, where China and Russia no longer supports the sanctions. Every time North Korea provokes, not all provocations, but the big provocations, typically the council would get together and add additional sanctions measure on North Korea. That's no longer possible with China and Russia not wanting to do any more sanction steps on North Korea. In fact, arguing that some of these sanctions have to be eased or relaxed. And plus, one of the boomerang effect of the war in Ukraine has been this newfound military alliance between North Korea and Russia. It's, seems to be the closest of allies. North Korean troops are there in the war field. Russia is supporting North Korea with its oil shipments, with its upgrading its weapons technology. The latest from the South Korean government defense ministry is that Russia is helping North Korea to upgrade its aerial defense systems, its missiles defense systems. So all kinds of things are going between Russia and North Korea. And this is one of the, I think, most significant consequences in the security order of Northeast Asia. And so therefore, if there was another round, and I think it's very possible given second President Trump, I think he will want another go at this. And unlike in the previous round, he will surround himself with people who will fully support him in this endeavor. Unlike in the previous round, and we know in the previous round, there were dissenters. There were clearly professionals, nuclear experts who thought this was a bad deal. So he was prevented from doing things his own way, and that was also a big reason why it didn't fly in the end. But I think if he goes for another round, he will want to do it his way and with the support of people around him to do it his way. And I think this is reflected in the personnel appointments that he is coming out with very first days after the election. So with Mr. Trump, fully supported by the domestic policy machinery. But the circumstances of the region is that it's no longer all big powers working towards denuclearization, but one of those big powers fully on the side of North Korea. And China, also very unhappy, I think, with this newfound closeness between Russia and North Korea. But will it be as supportive on any new initiative on North Korea's denuclearization? I think China will weigh a lot of elements, but given China's primary policy aim on the Korean Peninsula, which is stability, right? I think within that policy goal, there may be some room for South Korea, China, and the United States and Japan also to craft an initiative that moves the denuclearization agenda forward. Although, of course, from North Korea's side, he's not as desperate as he was in the previous round. North Korea is in a good place. It gets help to keep going, not just from China, but now also Russia. So the economy is not collapsing, as many had predicted under these many years of heavy sanctions. And it now has a security partner on its side when these discussions may come back to the table.
Yeah, I think that last piece about having a security partner at the discussions will really complicate the negotiating picture. But I'm also hearing kind of a through line through a lot of these answers that on 2 points. One is that, we all know that President Trump is seeking outcomes. He's seeking deals.
Mm-hmm.
And the shape of those deals, how those deals are done, what the shape of them are, will be more determinative of policy and less predictable than many countries would like. And then the second is that just kind of any constraints that there might have been towards seeking those outcomes that he had in the first administration, when I think the world didn't know what the priorities were, how the style would work. But also he had advisors that were very used to business as usual, the old way of doing things, and were resistant to those stylistic changes. They are now removed. So we have a Trump that has very few constraints on pursuing the type of agenda he would like to pursue, but very little clarity on how that agenda will impact the rest of the world's interest, priorities, and policies. With that in mind, I'd like to ask Raja a big, broad question about U.S. leadership in the world and international institutions. Obviously, like one aspect of this American First agenda that we can predict is a distaste and a distrust for U.S. commitments to international institutions and agreements. The second Trump administration has already signaled that we'll pull out of the Paris Agreement. And, I think following along his first term, President Trump has appointed a skeptic of international institutions, Representative Elise Stefanik, to be U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. So how do you think Asia is reacting and responding to Washington's changing vision of U.S. leadership in the world? Do you think that the countries of Asia are poised to take on a greater role? And how might different leadership in the international system, or even a lack of leadership in the international system, affect priorities and movements on issues that are important to the global agenda, whether that's, macroeconomic stability, climate change, all of these other transnational issues?
It's quite amazing to see how President Trump has turned the Republican Party from a, pro-globalization, pro-immigration, pro-internationalism into something completely the opposite of the ideas. It's amazing also for those of us in Asia to see globalism is a bad word in the new lexicon, where the reference to globalism automatically today means it's a bad thing for the American people. So we were all good students, learned at the America's feet and learned how the virtues of globalization. So now I think, given America's power, I think we have to adapt to this new phase. We can bemoan, for example, most Asians would love to see WTO come back, multilateral trading system come back, and US and China work together on the global economy. But quite clearly, that's not on the cards. So I think we don't have a choice here. We have to manage the consequences of what the number one economy in the world and a growing economy decides. So therefore, I think it puts most Asian countries, which are neighbors of China, have big trade relationship with China now, to disentangle, to de-risk. I think it's going to test every one of us. So I think that is the biggest challenge. Second, I think Asians were not as gung-ho on multilateralism in a general sense as a political instrument, like our European friends are. I mean, multilateralism is an ideology in Europe. In Asia, actually, we always tended to emphasize sovereignty, whether it is from Singapore to India to everyone in the region is for sovereignty. So it's nice to often hear Trump talk about sovereignty, of defending American sovereignty. So I think it's quite an inversion again, that Trump is saying, look, yeah, you guys defend your sovereignty, I'm going to defend mine. So I think this puts a premium on transactionalism. Asians in the end are pragmatic. We'll have to negotiate our own deals. But in the near term, the problem, Trump walked away from CPTPP. Now, most probably, he'll walk away from IPEF. So I think the choice for Asian countries in a slightly deglobalizing world, how do we rearrange our economic futures? I think that is the biggest challenge. On the other multilateral institutions, alliances, I think Japan and Korea already do quite a bit more than the Europeans. So there's less of a challenge. India wants to do more. Australia wants to do more. And I think the Biden administration has created new institutions, AUKUS, stronger Quad, and Chip 4. So people would be quite happy to work with these minilateral institutions, assuming Trump is in favor of them. On climate change, of course, here again, I mean, it's really, I think the end of illusions that you can put 200 countries in one room and negotiate a deal. I think that phase is over. The answer is really in technological solutions. Here again, America is one which produces a lot of the new solutions. Therefore, how do we get new ways of organizing the relationship between energy and economy? That is the core question. And I think that question is not going to come through a UN conference, but it's going to come through new technologies and new ways of doing things. Here again, I think a lot to learn from the US and work with the US again.
Thanks for that, Raja. I think that you brought up a number of good points. The shift away from kind of big multilateral group forums where consensus is very difficult to reach and, implementation and enforcement is difficult to track, to more minilateral offerings that are voluntary in nature, that are very issue specific, could be a way to move a needle on some of the issues and develop the kind of best practices or policy directions that other countries can voluntarily adopt over time if they're successful. So we may be entering into a period of greater experimentation in some ways, and perhaps that does bring out new and interesting solutions on important topics like climate change. I've deliberately, but somewhat poorly saved one of the biggest topics of conversation for my last question, which I will address to Robin. And of course, that's the major elephant in the room, which is US-China strategic competition. Obviously, this has been a big focus of not only the first Trump administration and the Biden administration's policy priorities, but also the campaign. Tell us a little bit about how you see this evolving in the second term. We have a number of China hawks in the cabinet, including Senator Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, who's currently under sanction by the Chinese government. because of his outspoken record on his criticism of China's human rights record. But on the other hand, it seems that, again, we've talked about a Trump that's very focused on outcomes. He wants a tough stance on China to produce results for the US economy, probably above all other priorities. You spent a lot of time talking to experts in the US, Asia, and Europe about this. Where are we headed? And what does it mean for global order and cohesion?
As you said, it's a huge question, and I'm like most people probably going to struggle to give you a clean answer because I'm not sure that there is a clean answer, certainly in the shape of the new Trump administration as it takes shape, or possibly even not in Donald Trump's mind either. And that's what makes all of this so difficult. Though I think one of your comments right at the beginning there, or as you introduced the question, is probably revealing. You noted that there are some real China hawks already appointed to senior positions in the new Trump administration, or will be, have been nominated at least to these positions, like Marco Rubio, who, as you said, deeply criticizes China's human rights record and has been put under sanctions for that reason by the Chinese. Well, that's not going to be a Donald Trump priority. Do we think Donald Trump, I'll be very frank here, cares about human rights in China? I don't think so. So the question then becomes, are the China hawks, are they aligned with their new president, and a president who's going to take absolutely keen interest in making sure that the balance of interests falls into place, where, as you said, Rory, he feels the United States is getting the best deal. So I think, we may end up with a rather empty conversation about whether Donald Trump is going to have a more hawkish approach to try to contain China's rising power, which you could say the Biden-Harris administration, or the Biden administration, was very clear about. They were trying to build alliances in such a way that China's rise would not end up being inimical, not just to the United States, but to, quote unquote, liberal, democratic, rules-based order, as they might think of it. I know that's a challenged term, but that is, I think, something that certainly animated the Biden administration. And in a way, interestingly enough, the allies all came in behind it in that particular approach. And I was describing how the Europeans a minute ago had taken a much tougher line to China, which was easier for them to do when they were with the Biden administration. But now they look at the Trump administration and say, which of these policies are we going to get? Are we going to get the prioritizers, the ones who say, like Elbridge Colby, used, I think, really almost as the cipher for this position, but the others hold it as well, that America should not be wasting its time in Europe. It needs to face down the main threat to American power in the future, which is the rise of China. And the reason that we have to fear the rise of China, because it's becoming a peer competitor militarily and technologically, and because ultimately it is a communist party state, which is therefore inimical to stable world order. That kind of, in a nutshell, the way I think many of the hawks think about it. And you've then either got the hawks who say, let's worry about China because it's also with Russia and North Korea and Iran, or you've got those who say, let's forget about the others, let's just focus on China qua China. But there's a whole, I sense certainly in this administration, I'd be interested to know how different it might be to the last one. But there's a whole nother side to this, which is the kind of America first approach. I think this administration is going to have America first much more as part of its foreign policy than the last one, which was competitions between various types of hawkish advisors, like John Bolton, amongst others, who are particularly hawkish. And on America first, there's two ways of looking at it. You could either say, as Trump has done, we need to put extremely high tariffs on China because ultimately all other countries are benefiting from exporting to the US market, where the market of last resort, the American consumer is basically making other countries rich, and we need to make ourselves rich. And the way to do that is something really fundamental. The Bob Lighthizer, the former US trade representative, whose position in this administration seems uncertain, if there is going to be one, but his view was that America needs to change its whole approach to world trade, its whole approach to globalization, use tariffs as a way of actually disconnecting America from its dependence on international trade to the extent it was before. Not escalate to de-escalate, which is the line that's been put out by one of the people, again, talked about as potential US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, or at least he was yesterday. I don't know if anything's happened today I've missed so far. Is that approach that very sort of, are we going to have a pragmatic approach that says raising sanctions is about trying to get, raising tariffs is about a way of trying to get a better trade deal for America? Or is raising tariffs a way of actually almost disconnecting America somewhat from the world economy and really making sure that America first, American companies are building for American jobs, and in the end, we don't want to do a deal with China at all. Now, those two outcomes are incredibly important for America's allies as well, because the danger is that we as Europeans, I'm sitting here in London, but I'll put it that way, just get wrapped up with China in the big tariff war. Because to be honest, Europe plus Japan plus Canada has a larger goods trade surplus with America than does China. I mean, so the G7, those wonderful allies, that wonderful hub for the Biden foreign policy in confronting China, could end up being the enemy, if you want to put it that way, of a second Trump administration. But when we look at the kind of appointment of Howard Lutnick, or at least again his nomination to be the Commerce Secretary, and that trade is going to be under this sort of Trump loyalist who probably is not completely bought into the Lighthizer idea of you really using tariffs to draw America out, we might end up with a more transactional approach. And so I think we're sitting here in Europe, certainly. I don't know how it looks to Raja. And we don't know which of these realities is going to be the one we're going to have to deal with next year. Is it the reality of an America that really tries in a second Trump administration to change the whole rules of world trade, that almost tries to extract America from the globalization convoy? Or is it one that's simply going to use this as a form of leverage to try and get a better deal for America? The America Firsters are, like J.D. Vance, just do not believe in world trade. They don't believe in it. So, I think we've got to be very careful to assume that Trump is simply going to be transactional, because honestly, I don't know which of these sets of advisors are going to hold sway in his mind.
Right. That's a really good point, that there are some people who really see a transformation of the global trading order as essential to protecting American interests. Some people see the tools that Trump has declared that he will employ as transactional leverage for specific deals. And either way, it seems that there will be pain introduced into the system in order to make changes. And I think, again, it feels a little bit now like the spinning wheel of where will that pain land exactly? Who's going to pay the price for this? And how will that type of pain, that price, affect decisions going forward on how the world sees international trade and commerce? We're coming to the end of my prepared questions. I do encourage you, if you're listening live today, to please put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can have a chance to address them in the last few minutes. But I do want to wrap up my kind of planned presentation with a lightning round of questions really fast. If you could, I'm going to go around to each of you, and I'll just go in the order that we just asked these last questions. So start with Kyung-wha, then Raja, then Robin. I would love to hear in two sentences or so, and I understand this is a tough task, but I know you guys are up to the challenge. What is one issue you're tracking that might have changed from Trump's first term to his second term, given the amount of events and experience that have transpired over the last 4 years? So Kyung-wha, over to you for that question.
Okay, give me one more sentence, because I have to premise this on one of two scenarios that Robin has laid out, and that is President Trump, basically a transactional leader wanting good deals, right? So not the whole, withdrawal of the from the world trading system. My two sentences: Asia, Southeast Asia, is the fastest growing region. Mr. Trump would know that. So greater engagement with South Asia, Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries, even with ASEAN.
Very good. Raja?
I think one of the things that came through in the Trump first administration was really to work with allies and partners to do more on technology collaboration, to bring Asian allies together. Whether that will, I'm not so sure how this is going to play out. I mean, I think in the name of burden sharing and the talk of integrated deterrence, the Biden administration has actually expanded technology cooperation, for example, between US and its Asian allies. Will Trump buy into that, or he simply will say, look, we'll sell you the stuff, what's all this stuff about sharing? I think for me, for India, which has invested in a technology relationship with the US in a deep way, we would like to see continuity and fear potential change.
Thank you. Robin?
Well, I'm going to pull off where I finished before, because I think maybe it's just a coda to my last comment. I think the key difference between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 is this is not one presidency going from term 1 to term 2. We're going to be jumping straight into a presidency that may end up being a lame duck within 2 years. I mean, that's just very unusual in the American political system. And I'm looking more at what is the Republican Party going to be. And I think, as I was denoting in my last question, I think the Republican Party is becoming something that is not the Boltons, it's not the Mike Waltzes, it's not the Rubios. It is the America of the 1930s. And that is a fundamental change for America's allies to have to think about in the future. And is the Democratic Party strong enough to be a counterweight to that? I don't know. But if one party has this as its driving mentality, and I do feel it's there, I have to say, then we're, even the sort of potential positiveness of the growing trade opportunities in Southeast Asia and Asia may be difficult for America to take full advantage of.
Okay, thank you. You guys have put a lot on the table at the end here, which I very much appreciate. I've read through the questions that have come through on our audience. I'm going to direct one to each of you. Robin, I'm going to go back to you first. We'll do this in reverse order. So a couple of questions here about China and Taiwan. I'm going to reframe them so we can fit more together. What do you think it would take for the U.S. to fundamentally change its approach to China? And how do you think Taiwan factors into that calculus?
Well, for America to change its thinking about China, I feel is structurally impossible in the sense that for all of the worries that Europeans have about America and democracy and what many Europeans see in a Trump administration as being undemocratic or anti-democratic, the fact of the matter is that America is a chaotic bottom-up democracy in which, fascinating new outcomes of politics can emerge. China is a top-down, one-party system that is potentially becoming more insecure rather than more secure in its future, given the faster than expected decline in growth rates, given the lack of the emergence of a consumer economy, given the decline in foreign investment, given this sort of inability to keep driving it forward. I think that China's suspicion of America and China's determination to seize this moment of opportunity to sort of build a global majority that does not accept American leadership and that pushes Europe back into sort of second-class status, that is going to always leave American leaders kind of rejecting that outcome. Because as much as they might want to think about themselves, as I said a minute ago, in a kind of very America first line, they do imagine America first and America at the top, not America as number two. And therefore, you're always going to have a side that's going to look at the rise of China's military capability and see it through the most negative eyes. And I'll come back to where I started this conversation. People in America I talk to don't talk about Russia's 1,500 deployed nuclear warheads and the fact that China is now moving in that direction, potentially by 2035, according to some DoD estimates. They now think of themselves as facing 3,000 nuclear warheads. It's America against China and Russia. And that kind of outlook, I think, is going to make America incredibly leery, whoever's in charge of it, of allowing China's rise to continue unchecked. So Taiwan, in the end, is not something that's on my front burner of concerns, but I think that 2049 anniversary date by which The Chinese leadership has proclaimed that Taiwan will be united again with China, is going to start to become a very, very dangerous state, starting about 2035 onwards. That becomes, in that time horizon, a very, very big worry for me.
Absolutely. And of course, Taiwan is where a lot of those threads of strategic competition between the US and China intersect, whether it's over like values or tech or geography, defense, US alliance commitments. So certainly an issue to watch as we get closer to that 2049 declared deadline. Raj, I'm going to turn to you now on Trump's interpersonal relationships. There was a question here about Trump-Modi and how the relationship has developed and evolved, but I wonder if we could broaden that a little bit. Like, what do you see as big trends in kind of Trump's interpersonal relationships with foreign leaders, and has that changed any over the last 4 years? Do you think there are relationships that will be strengthened or perhaps not be as strong as political leadership has changed in many areas of the world?
I think, at least from what we know about Trump's persona, I mean, I think he really bets on individual relationships and that his own personal capacity to negotiate. So I think that will endure, I presume, in terms of how we'll deal with the world's leaders. As far as we know from the first term, Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump have had a very good relationship. But don't forget, it's always tempered when Trump says Modi is a great guy. He also says, look, but he has high tariffs. India is a tariff king. So that theme never gets off whenever he talks about India or Mr. Modi. There's never letting go on the question of India's high tariffs. So I don't see him really changing in fundamental way. But I think for India starts on a good wicket, having had a reasonably good relationship. And unlike a treaty ally, our Asian friends or our European friends, it is not dependent on America for its security. Therefore, it's not losing its sleep that America will abandon its alliances. And we negotiated a set of terms of engagement with the US. And I think last 20 years, that has moved forward. So I think India will hope the next 4 years will also see a forward moment and the personal relationship can actually be managed. As long as India is creative enough to offer some trade, concessions, if you will, to please Mr. Trump, that is a reciprocal relationship. I think what he's looking for is reciprocity, that it's not that we are a free rider. I think that's where I think India will have to really work hard to show reciprocity that we're willing to give for getting something in return from the United States.
Great. So strong relationships with global leaders, but within a set of priorities that are not changeable, movable, or based on those strong relationships. Kyung-wha, my last question is going to be directed to you, and this is the point we'll close on. I think it's one of the most important things that we could discuss in an event like this. We have a question here about Asia's commitment to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resolution under the Trump administration. How do you see Asia's priorities and potential policies on this issue in a Trump second term?
Well, I think it's very much known what the new administration will do. I think that leaves the leadership on the climate change, at least as far as Asia is concerned, to China. China is the biggest emitter, but it's also the heaviest investor and technologically most advanced in these green technology areas. And so I think individual countries will stay committed. It's not just government, it's industries, it's civil society movement. So the momentum clearly is with the continuation of climate actions at individual government level. I think the fallout of the United States pulling out of this will be huge for the United States. But for Asian countries, I perhaps this is more of a wishful thinking than any objective analysis. But my bet is that the countries will stay the course. The domestic constituencies are just too big at this point. There was a time when America relaxed its commitment to climate change, the Asian countries went loose also. America no longer cares, so we can go easy. This is no longer the ground level feeling when it comes to climate change. And I think with America's withdrawing itself from the leadership on this issue. It will be China. And I think all countries will be wanting to work more closely with the European countries, since they have the highest standards when it comes to climate change.
Very good. So an area of potential cooperation between the Europe and Asia, one I'm sure that we at the Asia Society would love to do more work on in the coming years. I want to close by thanking all of the panelists here today for your time and your insights. I learned a lot from listening to you and look forward to getting this group back together as policy does evolve, perhaps quite quickly in Trump's second term. We'll come back together and discuss this again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you.